Now to Pakistan, where the crackdown on protesters supporting jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan appears also to be targeting journalists. Matiullah Jan, seen here in one of his YouTube videos, was reporting from protests demanding Imran Khan's release. The rally was broken up by a heavy state crackdown. Matiullah Jan's lawyer says he was missing for hours, but later found under arrest and in jail. In a video message on social media, Mr. Jan's son said his father's detention had been more like a kidnapping.
My father was abducted, along with his journalist colleague, outside a hospital at 11 p.m. yesterday. He was abducted by unknown people who picked them up in an unmarked car. They did not introduce themselves or say if they were police or army rangers.
Well, Matiullah Jan had been investigating deaths and injuries that happened during a raid on the protesters in the capital, Islamabad. Imran Khan's PTI party claims law enforcement agencies killed at least 23 PTI supporters and that the majority of the bodies had sustained bullet wounds. They say another 100 people were injured. Pakistani police, however, deny using live rounds. They say only 2 protesters died and that rioters killed 4 security officers. We can get more on this from Maheen Pracha, who's from the rights group Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Welcome to DW. Are you clear about whether government security forces use lethal ammunition to disperse these protests?
I think this is still cause for contention because we've received reports from secondary sources that live ammunition was used, but this has not been verified independently by the Human Rights Commission at the moment. We know that injured persons were brought to hospital, but as to how many deaths occurred, we cannot say with certainty at this point.
We've also been hearing reports that at least 2 journalists have been arrested or are missing. What is it about this particular story that means that the Pakistani government is so sensitive that they would crack down on reporters trying to cover it?
From what we know, journalist Matiullah Jan had gone to one of the hospitals in Islamabad to investigate reports of the bodies of protesters that may have succumbed to injuries as a result of firing. Shakir Avan is a court reporter who also reportedly went missing, and the Lahore High Court filed a petition was filed with the Lahore High Court earlier today, asking that he be produced. But in Matiullah's case, this is a very well-entrenched pattern of the state cracking down on journalists who are trying to establish information that is considered contentious or sensitive. There is a great deal of control over the media in Pakistan at the moment. And one way this is exercised is by disappearing journalists for short periods and then having them appear in custody on often trumped-up charges, as occurred in Matiullah's case.
I see. So it is not necessarily this story that is unusual, because this is part of a pattern of the way the Pakistani state suppresses dissent.
This has happened in the past before as well, yes, with journalists covering similar stories with regard to dissenting voices.
Now, the HCRP has called for the PTI and the government to engage in dialogue to find a peaceful way forward. Does the PTI party bear any responsibility for how this situation unfolded?
I think the situation has really just become untenable. The fact is that the PTI has the right to protest peacefully. This is enshrined in the Constitution. But what has happened is that the state has, over now many months, pushed what is a popular party against the wall. And in that situation, tensions are bound to escalate, as we saw over the weekend. But you have to understand that repressive tactics will not stamp out this general discontent among people. But the use of unwanted force against peaceful protesters is not acceptable.
Okay, not acceptable, but part of a pattern you seem to have indicated. So, do you see? Is it inevitable that Pakistan must continue along this path of authoritarian repression?
There are a number of steps that have been taken recently. We have seen X remains banned, VPNs remain, many of them remain blocked, and that's created a situation where finding verified information has become very difficult. We've seen that laws have been passed curbing freedom of assembly, especially in Islamabad, where these protests took place. And you've got a situation of hyper-regulation of assemblies. I think the situation cannot continue. It is unsustainable. It has to be reversed. If the political climate is to stabilize, if the economy is to stabilize, democracy also means governing and not merely playing a game of cat and mouse in this way.
Understood.
So it has to stabilize, and dialogue is ultimately the only way this will happen.
Thank you for joining us, Maheen Pracha from the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan.
Thank you.
We'll get more on this from Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for South Asia, Babu Pant, who joins us from Colombo. Welcome to DW. Are you clear whether government security forces used live ammunition against protesters?
Thank you for having me. Yes, as we have said previously, the government forces have used a range of unlawful force against the protesters. We are protesting, calling for the release of former Prime Minister. So we have verified the use of unlawful forces, including unlawful use of tear gases, other forces including lethal and non-lethal weapons. So this includes lethal weapons. And what's been more challenging in the last few days is the opacity of information surrounding the use of force, because information has been practically blocked. Journalists and other individual independent verifiers have not been able to access information because the government authorities are blocking the flow of information. So it's been very challenging to actually ascertain the scale and the nature of lethal force that has been used, and the number of casualties has been varied depending on the sources. So that's down to the total blocking of information by government sources.
Help us to understand the situation there. Are we looking at what you would normally expect to see in terms of a Pakistani government response to protests, or is there something about this particular issue, this story, that makes authorities cracking down on reporters, that makes this so important to them?
The nature of the crackdown on protesters we saw, including from the use of lethal, non-lethal weapons and other forms of unlawful force, is very concerning. But it also kind of reiterates the pattern of unlawful force used by the Pakistani authorities against PTI protesters, but also other protesters who have protested or dissented against the government in the past. So we see a clear pattern of the repeated use of unlawful force against protesters, and also the narrative from the government about demonizing the protesters and creating counter narratives against their right to protest.
You say that this falls into a pattern. Talk us through some of the other repressive tactics that you believe the Pakistani state is using to suppress dissent.
So the Pakistani state authorities, Pakistan recently, it would be important to point out that recently underwent at the UN Human Rights Committee its ICCPR review. So a range of states have recommended Pakistan to work better in terms of respecting human rights. What we have documented over the past few years is that the Pakistani authorities have used a range of different tactics to demonize any dissenters, even target journalists, human rights defenders, opposition politicians, and anyone who dares to dissent against the government. So these tactics have included a range of tactics, including from the use of enforced disappearance to forcibly disappear dissidents, including journalists, opposition politicians, human rights defenders, from the use of unlawful force against protesters, to the weaponization of laws,
Right.
to restrict freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of
Okay.
expression, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly as well.
Some Pakistanis see the PTI and Imran Khan as provocateurs, enticing vulnerable people to become their source of street power. Does the PTI bear any responsibility for these disturbances?
From what we see is that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So under international law, Pakistan government is obligated to protect the right to freedom of peaceful assembly in line with international law and its standards. So whoever is protesting, they should respect the people's right to freedom of expression and facilitate that. Even in some cases, if the protests are violent, the government has responsibility to actually de-escalate the situation and try to minimize and avoid the use of force in this situation. So I think it is on government of Pakistan to actually respect the people's right to freedom of assembly in line with their obligation under international law.
Thank you for joining us, Babu Pant from Amnesty International.
Thank you.